Uh, Good afternoon or good morning to everybody who's attending this third webinar in the LARC series. I'd like to start off today to acknowledge that we meet today on different lands across Australia. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet, work and live, and recognise that this land always has been and always will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. We recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters and culture, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Thank you so much for being here as we enter our third webinar in our Leading Australian Resilient Communities series. For those of you who don't know about LARC, I invite you to go to, or LARC might be new to you, to go to the ARLF website and you can find lots of information about the different parts of the program. The webinar program is a series of 6 webinars that we're carrying out in the timeframe that the program's running. And today's topic is around facilitating fundraising is the title. Before I introduce our guests, I just want to acknowledge that the LARC program is funded by the federal government and to acknowledge our partners in the Regional Australia Institute and the various leadership organisations who are our lead delivery partners in carrying out the program, and all their details and acknowledgements to them can also be found on the ARLF website. To introduce our guest today, I'd like to start with Jack Heath. Jack is the CEO at Philanthropy Australia and has been a leader in the charitable sector for more than 2 decades. He has a deep-seated belief in the ability of philanthropy to change lives. Jack sees philanthropy as a driving force for good in a time of diminished trust in institutions and huge societal challenges. He advocates for a philanthropy that is big-hearted, clear-headed and joyful. A little bit about Jack. After graduating from the University of Melbourne in Honours Arts and Law, he served in government as a diplomat, speechwriter and senior advisor to federal ministers. Following the suicide of his young cousin, Jack led the establishment of Reach Out youth mental health organisations in Australia, Ireland and the USA before serving as CEO at Sane Australia for more than 8 years. He has sat on a number of advisory boards and committees and received awards for his contributions to mental health. He now lives in Sydney with his publisher wife, Catherine Milne, and they have 2 adult children, Lucy and James, and a dog named Fred. Jack, thank you for being here today.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Great to be with you.
Our second guest is Tara Whitney. Tara is the principal consultant at Whitney Consulting, the founder of WA's largest and most successful specialist grant writing business, having secured over $95 million for clients in just 6 years. Before starting Whitney Consulting in 2017, Tara spent over 10 years in state and federal government assessing grant applications and business cases, which gives her a unique edge, knowing what assessors are looking for. Tara works with businesses, not-for-profits, local and state governments to acquire funding through grants, tenders and business cases. Tara, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Fantastic. We're going to dive straight into the questions. Just starting with you, Jack, can you tell us a little bit about Philanthropy Australia and the role it plays as the peak national body for philanthropy in Australia?
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. And can I just acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Gadigal lands and also pay my respects to elders past and present. And the other thing too is maybe by way of an apology in terms of those sort of bio things which are sort of sent through and given the audience. And one of the things was that the invitation was extended. I was super keen to take it up. I actually grew up in country Victoria and at Mooroopna, just outside of Shepparton there, as sometimes we explain to people from other states. And it was the suicide of my cousin on our farm that actually led me to doing all that work. And the other thing I should say is that if anyone's interested in contacting me, my Gmail address is Jack Heath. This is the private one, is jackheath3629@gmail. And for people who might know, 3629 is the postcode for Mooroopna. So I say that because that thing about growing up in country, for me, country Victoria, and all the work that we did for many years around youth suicide, we traveled to, I think it was something like, I think about 170 communities. Sorry, I'm taking you back to last century or whatever, but just my personal passion around that rural and regional issues and the need for them to be addressed is really important. That's why I was just sort of super pleased to receive the invitation to participate. So thank you for the indulgence in terms of by way of introduction. In terms of Philanthropy Australia, it's a role I've been in for 2 years now. And it's basically we're the peak organisation for philanthropic entities. We have about 860 members. It's roughly split about 50-50 between funding organisations, grants, grant makers, and also we do have a number of not-for-profit organisations as well. Our work is very much about how do we inspire more and better philanthropy. So in terms of the more bit, we put out an election statement last year, obviously prior to the election, and we were just thrilled when we saw the federal government pick up the agenda to double philanthropic giving by 2030. So that means about how we're going to grow giving in terms of structured giving, which is where PA, Philanthropy Australia's predominant focus is, around those trusts and foundations, individual givers and bequests. We're looking, latest data, about $2.5 billion a year. And so we're saying, how do we get that up to $5 billion by 2030? And the federal government, though, when they picked up the double giving agenda, they actually extended it across the board. So that means it's a bigger challenge, but it means how do we grow philanthropic giving from in the vicinity of about 13 billion to 26 by 2030. So it's a very ambitious agenda. The reason why we feel positive about it is there's extraordinary intergenerational transfer of wealth that's going to be happening over the next 5, 10, 20 years. We're talking trillions of dollars. And we did a major piece of research around this the year before last. What I was staggered when the results came back is that with that intergenerational wealth transfer, about 30% of it's going to be happening outside the big cities. So, like places like Wonthaggi, right, which we'd never imagined there'd be significant wealth transfer happening, it's going to be quite significant. Now, obviously, a lot of that is sort of tied up in homes, but it's roughly about 38% of the total wealth is held in the family home. And what we know is about 20% of wealth is held in superannuation. And so when we're looking at in terms of the advocacy and we're doing work with government, there's the Productivity Commission about to be terms of reference and commission is about to be announced any day now. We're super keen in terms of advocating for that, to grow that philanthropy and what it is that we can do to advance that. The one thing I would mention, and some of the people joining us today may be aware of this, we work very closely with Community Foundations Australia, and we were very, we were successful in terms of getting the previous government reinforced with the Labor government, agreeing to give DGR1 status to 28 community organisations, and I'm guessing, I think a couple might be in on this call at the moment. So the reason for going through all this is that we're the peak organisation, we're advocating to government, the Productivity Commission is going to be absolutely critical, but we as an organisation, and I personally see huge opportunities in terms of sort of the long-term wealth that's going to be passed down, and a huge opportunities in terms of getting funding. And I also need to say is it's great to have someone like Tara on this panel as well, talking to some of the specifics in terms of how we go about doing it. So look, it's a bit of a sort of a run around the world, but peak organisation around philanthropy, commitment to growing philanthropy in rural and regional Australia, and working hard, and will be over the next sort of year or so with the government. And also, sorry, last thing I'll say is also try to educate parliamentarians about the importance of philanthropy. And this is particularly a case, I would say, for Labor backbenchers. I worked for Labor ministers previously, so I'm a little bit familiar there, but there can be a view that philanthropy or giving is all about wealthy people trying to chase tax deductions. And when we sit down with backbenchers and we ask them to name philanthropic organisations active in their electorate, invariably they don't know who's there. You ask them about the organisations, they can list them, reel them off, tell you about the great work that's being done, but have got no idea that in many of those cases, not all, but many of those cases, there's philanthropic support behind it. So what we're trying to do is to bring up that political awareness of how important philanthropy is at a local community level. And I guess building off the last election is to try and reinforce with members of parliament that your ability to source a philanthropic dollar, not around climate change in terms of Climate 200, either from the big foundations or from within your community, is going to be critical to your political success. So we've got that other agenda that we're pushing. So sorry, I should stop now, but
No, don't be sorry.
get a bit carried away when we get into this territory.
You painted a great picture, Jack. Thank you very much. Tara, before I ask you a sort of a question on some of your views on government funding at the moment, you want to tell us a little bit about what your consultancy does?
Sure. So I'm in WA. I grew up in Pinjarra, which is regional WA down south. And when I moved to Pingelly, which is in the wheat belt, I went from working for the government. So I worked for the government assessing business cases and grant applications for many years. But I moved out to the wheat belt, and that's when I started my own business on the other side, so writing. So essentially what we do at Whitney Consulting and have been doing now for the past 6 years, during which time we have just hit 100 million in funding that we've managed to obtain in 6 years for our clients. We do that through grant writing. We do grants, tenders and business cases, and we will do the writing for you. So if you need a grant written, we absolutely can write your whole grant for you. We also have a service where you can write the grant yourself and we'll review it and give you the professional eye, cast the professional eye over and feedback. And we also have, because we do acknowledge that, especially for smaller not-for-profit organisations and sporting clubs and community groups, they may not have enough funding to pay for a grant writer, but they still need support. Grant writing it can be a lot of work, it can be confusing, and you've got to know how to do it right. So because I started out when I was out in the wheat belt, I was on every netball committee and school P&C and all of that, and I knew how much they needed help getting the grant funding. But I also knew that they couldn't afford me. They couldn't afford a grant writer. So I have also developed an online course, which is basically really cheap, $197, hand in hand. As you go through the course, you literally write the grant application, and it spits out, you spit out your grant application at the end. You've written it at the end. And we do workshops and things like that as well. We do online and face-to-face grant writing workshops. So anything that will help you to get funding. We do have, we do a lot of government grants. We do work in the philanthropy space as well. But as I said, we're usually looking at sort of at least 20, 50,000 plus. Often our grants are sort of 100,000 plus because of, if we're writing it for you, it's not a cheap thing to write a grant because it takes a lot of work. I'm sure you all know.
Absolutely, and I have a follow-up question for you, which I'll ask in just a moment. I would just encourage our attendees, if you wish to get obviously it's just our guests and myself on the screen today. If you would like to share your name and where you're from in the chat, so that you can all get a feel for where you all are, you're more than welcome to do so. But Tara, just getting back to you, so given the consulting work that you're doing and your history in government, you've obviously got a lot of experience in that world of government funding. What's your opinion on the application process, as in getting harder, easier, more rigorous, and perhaps the level of competition that applicants are facing these days?
Sure, it has been changing over the past few years. I would definitely say it's getting more competitive. A lot of people are getting more savvy about what is out there, what grants are out there. They're seeing other people get it and going, well, I think I can get it. So more people are applying, but there is a lot of money out there. I've heard quoted $80 billion in grants a year in Australia. There's a lot of money out there in grants, but yes, it is getting more competitive. So you do need to know how to do it. The trends I've seen have been some governments are starting to understand the amount of work involved in writing a grant application. And so they've started to introduce an EOI process or a two-stage process. So rather than going right to the end and the full-on everything, they're doing a bit of an EOI where they can say to you, yes, we're interested, you align, and therefore you're through to the next stage. So that has started to happen. The other trend I've seen is everything is going online, as with everything else in the world. So you've got a lot of online grants portals like your Smarty Grants, which is meaning that word limits are becoming more and more a thing. So sometimes that hasn't been a thing in the past. So you've really got to be clear and concise to fit into the word limits. So there are a few trends, I suppose, I've seen in the past few years.
It makes me glad that my role doesn't involve grant writing these days. I'm not strong in the details. So Jack, in regards to Tara's mentioned, a lot of grants and a lot of money out there at the moment. What is the state of philanthropy in Australia at this time? I suppose if I'm being crude, is there much money floating around at the moment?
Yeah, so what's interesting in terms of the trends is that we're seeing a fewer number of people giving more dollars. This is an international trend that's happening as well in the UK and the US. And so we've done a fair bit of research. And if you look at sort of giving rates or people claiming tax deductions, it's pretty well been trending down for the last 10 or so years. The dollars have been going up in absolute terms, but that's because you've had the likes of whether it's a Ramsay Foundation where we're talking about, or Minderoo Foundation or the Judith Nielsen Foundation where we're talking about literally billions of dollars being put into foundations. That's sort of keeping it propped up at the moment. I think one of the challenges around this is that we've really, and one of the things we're trying to do at Philanthropy Australia is encouraging those big givers to be giving more and connecting them into their peers. There is a number of foundations who are out there who operate privately under the radar, who are making huge contributions right around the country. And, a number of our prominent members or whatever, many of them will be known to you, who are big supporters as well. So I think the overall dollars are going to continue to grow. Obviously, there's around the high net worth, but they're people who are talking about big bets. So they're talking about really huge, grants that they're looking to make. In terms of that more of that local area piece, outside the government funding, it's more about, and I think it will become, stronger over the coming probably 5 to 10 years, is around the community foundations piece. It was interesting. We were doing a job interview with someone today who was saying how her experience was, people would talk about, I want to fund stuff, around particular issues overseas. And her first question was to them, well, what are you doing in your local community already? Do you know what I mean? Like, how well is your giving practice located, in terms of those people who are around you at the moment? So what I'm saying, I guess, there is that the community foundations, the local funding piece is a longer play. But what will happen is that if we can communicate, and this is working with our non-for-profit partners and others, I think if someone sort of, you talked about Tara, being down in the south there, I think there's I'm not sure if it's anywhere near the Albany Foundation, but I think what's going to happen is that with those transfers of wealth, if we've been able to communicate to, for want of a better term, Auntie Joan, who might have been sitting there on a property, about the services and the work that's being done in the local community, and to be able to make the connection that her leaving, in her will, a gift to them is I think is going to be really important. And I think that this is more important and more prevalent today than it has been. And I think a combination of bushfires, floods, lockdowns and the like have made us focus more on our local community. And so people, I think, will start to give more if they realise that their gift is going to be left to the local Meals on Wheels organisation in that particular community. But we've got a lot of work to do to educate people around that will space, because the latest data is only about 7% of people will leave a philanthropic gift in their wills. But people are connected to community. We've just got to make it easier and make it apparent for them to be able to fund into those local communities. Last thing I'll just say is that I'm also involved in a Buddhist organisation down the New South Wales South Coast, and we spent hundreds of hours in that trying to do funding applications, and it is so competitive. I can just echo what Tara was saying in that regard. And so one of the things also too that we found is that when it's super competitive, and this is why, whether it's getting services from Tara's or others around the grant writing, it's really critical, is that when you have a highly competitive process, if you're a bureaucrat, people are looking for reasons to cross you out, because then there's not so many people that they have to consider. And I know in terms of personal experience at great pain, we were told, our organisation was told that we hadn't provided adequate detail around the costings involved with the project. As it turned out, I think we'd spent $5,000 getting quantity surveyors, right, to go through and document all this. But because this section of the area on the website didn't enable us to load up all the information, they didn't go to the attachment to look through it. So this thing is that with the grant writing, getting that expert advice is absolutely critical, because when these guys are being inundated with so many applications, I think one of the first things they do is to go through and see who can we strike off because they haven't answered all the questions properly. So a couple of observations there as well.
Tara, I can see you nodding and your expression. Did you want to respond to or comment anything that Jack has just shared?
Yeah, look, just to absolutely say I agree, Jack. It's 100% what they do, and it is, as a past assessor myself, obviously I have the insights as to what we would do when we were assessing, and for sure, if you get so many, and as soon as you get one where it's a one sentence answer, that every answer is one sentence, you go, nope, not enough information, not enough information. Any reason to focus on the gold, you will do, because you're not going to be able to. Generally, there are some grants that aren't as competitive, but in general, most grant programs are oversubscribed, meaning that we cannot fund everyone. And usually they're so oversubscribed that the grants assessors can't even fund all the ones they would want to fund. So if we can't even fund all of the great applications or the good to great applications, then as soon as there's anything that's not quite right in yours, you haven't even made it to good, so you've got no chance. You really need to be good or great, preferably great, to be able to get the funding for sure.
It almost sounds like when you're watching American TV, the process of getting a student to Yale or Harvard, it sort of sounds like our grant application process is almost becoming as emotional and difficult as that. So before I ask another question, I'm just inviting those who are viewing, if you do have a question for Tara or Jack, please put it in the Q&A and I'll be able to ask them on your behalf. But Tara, with complex EOIs and applications, large geographic areas or financial responsibilities for delivery and complex acquittals, it often feels or appears that large entities only have the capacity to apply for significant grants. Is that a fair statement?
Not necessarily, but it certainly would be more common. And the reason is that when you're applying for a grant, there are two key areas that a grants assessor looks for. One of them is how closely aligned are you to what they're trying to achieve. So grants are paying for something. They're paying for an outcome. They're paying for a benefit. So it's how closely your project is going to give the benefits that grant program wants to pay for. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is how likely you are as an organisation to be able to deliver that project. So you might have said, here's my project. It is absolutely going to nail what it is you're trying to achieve as a grants program. But if you have a budget in there that's not viable, no way you can do it for that amount. Or, and this is where it comes into the organisation side, if you're not necessarily a capable organisation, if you don't have the project management processes in place or the governance in place, the oversight over the project in place, then the assessor is not certain that you're going to be able to deliver the project to scope, to budget and on time. So that's why your larger organisations will generally get the bigger dollars, because they have more structures in place, they have more policies, they have more experienced project managers and better governance in place. So it's not the case that you have to be a large organisation. It is the case that you have to be a minimal risk to the grant giver. So you need to prove that your organisation is a capable one and you've got everything in place to be able to deliver that project. And that is obviously a lot easier if you're a more established, bigger organisation. But it's not impossible for a smaller organisation.
Jack, from a philanthropic perspective, you got any thoughts that you'd like to add?
A couple of things there. One is, I think, is that if you're looking to apply for grants, is to see whether or not, if you're after a small grant, is there a small grants program, and to have a sort of a realistic assessment in terms of what your chances are. The other two other things I'd say. One is just like persist. I know in terms of setting up, not-for-profit organisations myself, you get to moments where you're just sort of saying, this is too hard, too difficult, I think I'm going to give up. Just when you believe and you've got that passion, just keep going. And the other thing too is that, be careful about getting pissed off when you don't get grants. I sort of often used to do that until we, in one of the previous organisations, we actually started making grants ourselves. We were given funds to distribute, and we were genuinely distressed because there were so many more organisations that met the criteria and we wanted to fund. So I guess I'm just saying there is that if you get a no or whatever, it's not, and please don't take it personally, because I know, and there's been other sort of grants rounds where I've been asked to sit on, where I know that there would have been at least twice as many organisations that you thought could really have developed it well. So I think this is the thing about the persistence thing is really important. In terms of the philanthropic piece, one of the things maybe I should have said at the outset is that the philanthropic dollar is a relatively small component of the overall not-for-profit spend. And if we're talking about structured philanthropy, which is the foundations, the grants, the bequests, those sorts of things, we're talking about less than 2% of the funding that goes to not-for-profit organisations. So with those, they will be interested either in doing stuff in a particular community or an area. So go and look at those foundations that might have a focus on rural and regional areas, or are tied to a specific community. As I say, go back and look for community foundations as well. But the other thing too is to really, I guess, understand what those foundations' passion is about, and to look at the level of grants that they've been making in the past to make sure that you're not wasting time.
Awesome, thank you.
And on that, Andrew, I'll just also reiterate with what Jack's saying. Yeah, don't persist, but also make sure you ask for feedback. Now, it does vary. If you get a no, some grants won't give you a lot of feedback, or they won't give you great feedback, but do ask, always try to get it. And when you do ask for feedback, don't just come at them with, why didn't I get the grant? Because you're not going to get a lot back. Actually ask specific questions. So go to them and say, can you please tell me which of the questions we didn't score as highly in? Can you please tell me what are some areas of our application we could improve for next time? Be specific with your request for feedback, because the grants assessors do get attacked. They do get people going, well, why on earth didn't we get it? This guy got it and he's not as good as us. So sometimes when a request for feedback comes in, they're automatically defensive. Whereas if your request for feedback comes in with, thank you so much, can you please let me know, was there one particular area we didn't score as highly on that we can improve for next time? It shows you actually really want this feedback. You're willing to learn, you're willing to improve. So that would be my recommendation if you do get a no.
And I know that these, sorry, I was going to say, I just know that sometimes there's high turnover in terms of these areas, but where people are administering grants, say on a regular basis, the sort of engagement that Tara's sort of talking about gets you on their radar. Do you know what I mean? And it's sort of like, you might not have got this time, but it's an investment. It's so you're putting down a little bit of investment in terms of your next application. So just bear that in mind as well.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate that, and it fits that curiosity, I suppose, Tara, that you're talking about going asking for feedback fits well with the learning we try to facilitate with our participants at the foundation around instead of going in with a set or a mindset, being curious about that feedback and being open to hearing it and the way you ask. So that's fantastic. This is a question for both of you. So in regards to what we would just talked about, a lot of our listeners will be part of regional communities and often part of smaller organizations, and at acknowledging that while you don't have to be a large organization, but it obviously capacity and competency often means that it is. Do you see ways in which people who are part of smaller organizations, part of small communities, can ensure that their people that they love, their communities and regions that they love, can benefit locally from some of these much larger projects and dollars that are going around, whether that's collaboration, partnerships?
I'll start off there, Jack. Then, yes, I do. First of all, there is a lot of grants will allow you to auspice, which means that you can go under the banner of a larger organisation. So often if you're not incorporated, for example, you might not be eligible. But you are an organisation, you're doing things, you want to get the grant, you can often be auspiced by another bigger organisation. It depends on the grant as to whether that's allowed, and you'll need to find somebody who's willing to do it, because the auspicing organisation then takes on the responsibility. If you don't do the project, they have to pay the money back. They have to take on that reporting responsibility. So, they're putting their necks out. So you've got to find the right one. Potentially your local government would be one that might be able to help you there. That's the local government's job. That's what they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be enhancing their local area. So if you're an organisation that is wanting to get grants, you might not be able to, you might not have the capacity, have a chat to your local government and just say to them, this is what we want to do in the community. This is the grant we want to get. We don't think we've got the capacity, or we just need your assistance. So would you sit on the steering committee? We're going to set up a steering committee to run the project. Would you have someone from the local government sit on it? Would you have someone from the local government become the project manager that we can nominate for the project? So that then you're showing that you've got a project manager who's qualified, they're hired by the local government, so they've got that backing. That would be one way that I would sort of recommend to go about it.
And I just to add to that sort of, and it's a little bit longer term approach to it, but in all seriousness, I'd encourage anyone that's here to actually go and engage with their local member. And you can go and say, well, Philanthropy Australia tells us there's lots of money out there, and this is going to be, critical in terms of political survival. Do you mean? I think it's really, it's a bit, sort of bit of a throwaway line, but really about trying to engage your local members about the opportunity that's provided by philanthropy. And I think one of the things, developments that's happening that's quite interesting, and some of the people joining us may have come across this, is that Jim Chalmers, who's the treasurer, is sort of based in Logan, and there's been the whole sort of Logan initiative around local-based activities, and he's certainly got a disposition to place-based funding. Number of organisations who are sort of quite active in that place-based area. And we're expecting that is going to become a source of significant additional funding from philanthropy, and also I think from governments over the coming years. So I think that there's there's the opportunity for there to be a lot more funding flowing alongside all the reforms around community foundations as well. But I guess something that helps us, that helps you, that helps the sector, is to really engage with your local member and try and help educate them about the opportunity that's coming there from philanthropy, because we're certainly pushing hard, certainly at a federal level, I mean, down the track a little bit at state level, but we're going to backbenchers saying, what are the organisations active in the area? So they can probably name, most of the people here, but where's philanthropy involved? What are they doing? And just say that people are telling us there's a hell of a lot of money out there. What can you do to help us secure that?
Fantastic. Thank you both. I've got a question here from Arthur that I'll read out, and it sort of harks back to getting feedback on applications. His note is this: as a small community organisation, we've had a mix of outcomes of funding and grants. He's experienced that some years the panel is flexible and others not. One year we were successful to receive grants and submitted a successful program, and the next year they rejected the application. So I assume the same body, saying that the organisation doesn't have the capacity. He expresses his frustration in all that investment, especially after they've done a successful round. So his question is, can you actually contest grant outcomes with a funding body rather than just asking questions?
Short answer is no. Long answer is politically you can do anything. So you can make enough political noise, then you can make enough political noise. But the short answer is no, you can't contest grant outcomes. A potential reason behind why one year you got it, the other you didn't, is, well, there's a few potential reasons. One would be you may not have explained your expertise, your capacity as an organisation as well in the second application. Secondly, it may be a case that, well, they can only fund a certain amount of organisations. You got funded last year, so they're going to fund somebody else this year because they want to see somebody else also benefit. Could be another reason, or it could be that they weren't happy with how you delivered your grant. Maybe you hadn't acquitted your grant yet. Who knows? But there are a few reasons as to why that can happen. It could also just be that there were a lot more applications in the second year, and they were more competitive than you. So they were from organisations that were more capable, showed their capacity and capability far better than you did in that second year, whereas in the first year, maybe it was a newer grant, not as many people applied potentially.
Thanks, Tara.
Andrew, can I just a couple of things on that? One is that sort of issue that I think it was Arthur or whatever identified, it's not peculiar to small organisations. Sometimes when you have that experience, you think it's because I'm a small organisation. I mean, I've got direct experience of having worked with, a major foundation that, their big thing was about, we're going to make sure you meet the, capability criteria. And we met it one year and they said, oh, yes, you met the capability, but you weren't successful in funding. And the following year, despite us actually having improved services, they said, oh, your capability is actually not up to scratch. And so sometimes these things are a bit random and sometimes there's not explanations, and that's really, really hard to bear. But again, it goes back to that thing around persistency. The other thing too, just I would say is that, and again, look to where there's the possibility of getting multi-year grants, organisations that support you over a number of years, because otherwise, we want to keep going, but sometimes we can almost get in a year-to-year crisis sort of approach. Sometimes that's what we need to do to survive, but also just have a mind to be able to sort of look to those grants that might be multi-year, or if you've been able to build a relationship with a philanthropist or whatever, talk to them about getting multi-year funding or the need for it, and think about that strategically, because a lot of the philanthropic organisations are actually now looking to do longer term grants, but possibly with fewer organisations. So in terms of the work that you're doing, think also in terms of what are the opportunities around those longer term grants. Obviously, in some cases, you just need to get across the line for another 12 months. But the challenge is if we're chasing our tail every 12 months, it can be really hard. And last thing, just to say, really good to connect with your peers around this, because you believe passionately in a cause, you put in an application, you do all this hard work, it doesn't get up. It can feel like real shit, to be honest. It feels terrible. It feels like you're rejected, that people don't care, they don't get it. See if you can try and reach out to your peers or whatever to talk about these experiences as well, because chances others have gone through that. But the thing is, when we're really passionate and driven about something, we sort of feel like, oh God, we got rejected. Do you know what I mean? Like, so reach out and connect with your peers or talk to other people about their experience as well.
Yeah, while we're waiting for some more questions to come in from our attendees, that was either of you, if you've witnessed that, have you had clients or people that you've worked alongside where they've had the maybe they've wanted to get something up and they've suffered sort of, multi-attempt, perhaps multi-year rejection to finally they made it through and got the money? I'm sure in your careers you've come across that kind of those kind of stories. Have you seen people that have just persisted and they got there eventually after multiple failures?
Yeah, definitely. I have. I know one of our clients, it was an exceptional, I mean, I'm going to say that because I wrote it, but I believe it was an exceptional application. And the feedback they got was, it's great. But, and this links into something that I've seen Robert making a comment on. Their feedback was that it was great. It was a brilliant application, of course, but that the benefits were to a smaller population because the particular town that this project was in wasn't a big town. So they got knocked back because there were other projects that were delivering bigger benefits to bigger regional centres, to more people. And there's not a lot you can do about that. If you're located in a small town and there's not a lot you can do. You can't all of a sudden increase your population by 100,000 to argue against that. So they just persisted. They just put the application in again the next year, and I think it might have been 2 or 3 goes, and they were successful. So yes, it is very worthwhile finding out why it is you're not successful, understanding that, and then persisting, because you certainly can get there in the end.
Yeah.
I just say, despite all the connections and everything I had, pretty significant levels, it was getting funding for the reach out piece initially was really, really difficult. And there are times where you sort of think, I'm going to give up on this, but you believe in what you're doing and you keep going. And sometimes it's just after you've gone through your lowest point, was it the turning of the, was it the lowest ebb comes before the turning of the tide or whatever. So that thing about keep going. The other thing too, though, is that sometimes it doesn't work out. And, you know, I have scars from this in terms of the work that we went and did setting up in the United States. And, you know, to this day, I still struggle to understand why we weren't able to sort of carry it through. We'd reached 1 million young people within 12 months, you know, 1 million suicide attempts each year in the United States. You know, sometimes these things just don't work out. Do you know what I mean? Despite our best intentions and all that we do. And you know what, at the end of the day, that's sort of okay. But it's, I'm not saying don't persist, but, you know, sometimes for some reasons or whatever, things don't work out how we'd planned and hoped. And I think in that context, just a shout out to people individually to really make sure we look after ourselves in terms of going through these processes, because, you know, I think in past I've had a bit of a savior, you know, mentality or whatever, and you take stuff on that, do you know what I mean? Like, people are not asking you to take on, and you can get quite stressed yourself. So just that thing about making sure that we've got the self-care in place, that we've got friends or others that we can talk to, and just knowing that, you know, there's value in terms of that work that we try and do for other people, but sometimes it doesn't work out, and that's okay.
Great, thank you both. I've got a question it's around, so in our learning in the foundation, we're big on affiliation. We talk about the you know, sharing of responsibility and power, and co-contributions, having skin in the game. So while we understand the value of those concepts like co-contribution, collaborating, skin in the game, there are tensions or downsides that can come with managing grant activities along with co-contributions and collaborating. So acknowledging that can be a stress or a demand, can you either of you talk a little bit about the reason for co-contributions and how we can align funder expectations with the reality of project and program delivery?
Yeah,
it's quite a detailed question.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to start. Firstly, I suppose I'll touch on the co-contributions in terms of the money side of it. Obviously, if a grant program has, you know, a certain amount of money, it wants to help as many people as possible. So it you know, if it has to fund 100% of the project, it can't fund as many projects. So it needs that co-contribution so that it can fund more projects and do more good. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason, as you said, skin in the game. It's proving that you as an organisation have identified the need for this project. You've planned it. You've put a lot of effort into it. You've put so much effort into it. You really believe in it enough that you're putting money in as well. So there's a couple of reasons there around the co-contributions. In terms of co-contributions and collaboration, so more the partnership side of it, and why government sort of, or grants sort of seem to like the idea of partnerships. That is around a few things. One is making sure that we're not duplicating effort. We're not reinventing the wheel. They want to know that, you know, if you are an organisation working on a particular area, they want to make sure that you're working with others that do the similar same thing. They want to make sure that, you know, there is absolutely no need to start a whole new organisation that does the exact same thing that is, you know, another one organisation is doing over here. So they want to make sure that there's efficiencies, that you are working with others who can bring in their expertise, can bring in their stakeholders, their engagement, their communications, everything that they can bring in. It's really beneficial. You know, you don't know what you don't know. So as an organisation, you might think that you absolutely have the key to solve this problem and you're the only one that can do it. But you don't know necessarily what this other organisation is doing over here unless you talk to them. And when you talk to them, magic can happen where you can come up with something together that is going to have so much more of an impact. So that is what is trying to be facilitated there. So I know that it can be annoying, it can be work. But from a grants assessor's perspective and a funding body's perspective, they are investors. We are investing in something. We want to make sure we get the most value for money out of our investment as possible. And that means we want to make sure that you know the lay of the land, you're working with others, you're being efficient, you're using the expertise from other organisations, not just within your own.
Yeah.
Andrew, just again, a couple of things to add around that is that one of the things I love in terms of ARLF is around the values and that you've articulated as an organisation and the processes that you've gone through to do that. I think that's really important for non-profit organisations across the board, and an exercise in terms of going through and working out what your values and behaviours are, I think becomes really important before you go into partnerships or doing work with other organisations. So I know it sort of can feel a bit airy-fairy talking about some of these things, but it's a little bit like, okay, what are the things that we stand for as an organisation, as a group of people, however small you might be? What are the things that we actually really believe deeply in? And when you come to have conversations with other organisations that you lead in terms of your values and behaviours, this is what we believe in, because it sets it up for a more the opportunity for, you know, a genuine collaboration or partnership. And so the importance of values and that I just couldn't emphasize too much. The other point, and maybe this is probably something I should have said at the outset, but having been, you know, working for not-for-profit organizations, you know, for a couple of decades and stuff, is that there's always the challenge around the cost of, if you like, what people call overheads. And Philanthropy Australia, with a couple of other organisations, and that has been doing work for a couple of years around what we call the Pay What It Takes initiative. And in that program, we work with CSI. We also work with Social Ventures, the Ramsay Foundation, and Origin Foundation, a number of others. Is that, you know, one of the big risks, and I was guilty of this in the past, was that you try and run on the smell of an oily rag. You go out and you bid for projects, right? And you haven't got the back office covered, right? So, and people feel bad about saying, oh, you know, my overhead is 25%. So for people that are interested in going, look, if you go to the Philanthropy Australia website, you can find more about it. But we basically did research around what does it actually cost to run an organization? And this is the Pay What It Takes concept. And look, you know, it varies a little bit in terms of size of organization and all that, but usually it's 25 to 35% of your funds are going to what's called back office. And this is an assessment that's been done. It's a similar result they found in the United States. This is the nature of things. And so one of the big advocacy things that PA's been doing is to try and educate just funders initially. Government's a harder case, but to actually explain to people what the actual costs are of running these services. So if you go to that report, Pay What It Takes, it gives you a bit of an idea or whatever if you're in discussions with people. The second thing sort of off the back of that is that, you know, often us in not-for-profit will do the dance because we feel desperate about getting funding, where we'll actually underprice things, right? It's sort of like, oh, I've got to, you know, I just need to keep going. And so we set up almost a volcano effect. And we go on a bit of a dance. And so, you know, and I think I did this, we'd look at some organizations and say, oh, what could we get away with in terms of overhead? And it's really important to try and find those organizations that you can have direct conversations with them. And we're trying to educate all the foundations and givers that really you need to be doing a minimum of 25% in terms of those costs if you want to build sustainable organizations. So reports there if people want to be able to use that. But again, it's a little bit like, I'd say, almost organizational self-care. If sometimes we go out and try and get all these additional grants and there's a big volcano, you know, there's a big hole in the middle. So think more about our long-term sustainability.
So thanks, Jack. I'm just wondering how many heart attacks you just caused online. Then I come from the not-for-profit sector myself in service delivery, and I well remember conversations with funders where the line was, your overheads will not be over 10%. So I am passionately glad to hear you saying 25. I'm just wonder how many people have fainted while listening.
Well, I mean, the report, the research that we did was to actually go through, and the thing that's about this is it's far less than what business provides, right? The cost of business, if you look at training, research and development, IT management, it's between 2 to 3 times the percentage that not-for-profit organisations spend. But it's sort of like there's this sort of realization, if you're not for profit, there's overhead, right? But we don't, when you go to jump on a plane, right, you don't go and say, I'm going to fly this particular airline because they spend a less amount of money on safety and training their pilots. So it's very much, I think it's very much about, and it's hard because, you want to get the funding, you're worried about, prejudicing your chances of getting the funding. But we and this is one of the things at PA, we're trying to build that trust between the not-for-profit organisations, the grant seekers and the grant makers. Because one of the things that we know, and there's some work that was done by Liz Gillies, who's involved in the Menzies Foundation. So she did research about 7-8 years ago and then repeated it about 18 months ago. And what was really interesting there, I thought, was that she would go to funders and say, how good is the quality of the relationship between you and the people that you make grants for? And the funders say, we're probably about 7 or 8 out of 10. And then when you go and talk to the not-for-profit organisations, the grant recipients, they're rating it about a 4 to 5. So the challenge is that we need to try and find ways of creating environments where you can have direct conversations. And we're certainly encouraging funders to try and do that. Because if we're sort of not being, if as a not-for-profit, we're keeping things under the table or we're not being fully transparent about things, everyone suffers, right? Everyone suffers because you could be setting yourself up for failure. And so we're trying to educate funders to be able to sort of, really go down and build relationship. And so at the same time, it's about trying to be more direct as a not-for-profit organisation. Now, it's easier said than done. But we're really, PA, Philanthropy Australia, we're really trying to build that sense of safety so that funders and grant recipients are able to speak pretty honestly and directly in terms of the situation. Because when you build that authentic relationship, and I've seen it time and time again, the funders actually respond well to that. And you'll often find they'll come in and provide additional funding without even sort of, needing to go through applications. So, try and think about ways that we can build that relationship of trust.
Fantastic. While we're talking about trust and sort of talking about money as well, I suppose in an ideal world, Tara, just alluding back to what you were having conversations with other organisations and stakeholders in your area, so that funders know that you're not duplicating and so on and so forth. In an ideal world, I suppose we would have those collaborative relationships and arrangements before we go for funding. But sometimes, often, that hasn't happened, and it's sort of worked into the process. And I've just got a question here. It says, how can you build into a grant application the resources to collaborate meaningfully? Someone just commented, this is an area where we seem to under-resource, and budgets are often justified by the output, not the time, people, and cost of collaborating. Do you have any thoughts on that, either of you?
Well, my thoughts are it's got to be in your budget. From a grants perspective, if it depends on what grant it is as to what they'll allow to be funded. But if you don't sit down before you put in your grant application and seriously think about exactly what it's going to take you to deliver that project, and really calculate how much it's going to cost and put that allowance into your budget, then the grants assessors aren't just going to pay you extra money that you haven't asked for. So from one aspect, you've got to identify that up front. You need to really plan your project so well that you know exactly what it's going to take, how long it's going to take, and allocate the funding to do that in your budget. So that's the first point I'll make. But I do note that, with a lot of government grants in particular, they don't necessarily, they're not for the ongoing management of the organisation. They don't want to fund your utilities, your rent, etc. That's not what they're funding. They're wanting to fund a particular program. They want you to be sustainable outside of this grant. So they are sort of thinking potentially that you've got staff, you're doing this sort of stuff already. So you've just got to be careful about which grants you go for and what your funding strategy is. Are you an organisation that is fully reliant on grant funding from one day to the next, or do you have other funding sources coming in, other revenue streams, other ways of getting money into the organisation and not just grants? And secondly, just because you can get a grant doesn't mean you should. You need to have actually thought about whether or not it's aligned to your strategic direction of your organisation, your principles, what it is you're trying to do, your vision, whether or not it's going to be delivering on what you're trying to do. So you've got to think about whether or not you apply first, because grants take work. They take work to apply for, they take work to deliver the project, they take work to report on. You need to know whether you're willing to put in that work.
You raise a really good point, Tara. I actually was just speaking to a colleague the other day who did a first one or two-year round of a particularly funded project, decided this is not our core business, despite performing very highly, and went to their funder and said, we don't want it for the next round because this is not, while we did well, we don't have the ongoing capacity, nor do we want to do it as part of our core business. And they actually gave it back. So you really raised a good point there. So thank you. Jack, did you want to add in?
Oh, look, I just sort of, I don't know, by way of final piece is that one of these things is that, and this is to people who are joining it sort of at a personal level, is we care passionately and deeply about the particular area and stuff that we're working in. For me, and this might sound a bit strange, but it's sort of like, make sure that we keep the fire in the belly, right? Keep the fire in the belly, keep your heart warm, but try and keep a cool head. Do you know what I mean? When you get things knocked back and all that, it's just really important to try and sort of separate, if you like, the heat in the body. So try and keep a cool head, your heart's warm and your belly's firing along. And I think that if we see, because sometimes I think funders react and, and I know personally when I've been so passionate about something or so outraged that it almost got in the way of being able to be successful. It's like, don't give up the passion and all that, but as hard as it might be, sometimes try and keep that really cool head. And so many of the, things that Tara's sort of spoken to about, how you're going through your grant applications, being considerate and looking at different things. Try, to the best that we can, keep the head cool, heart warm, and the fire in the belly.
Fantastic. Just in our last couple of minutes, yes, was there any final thoughts or words that you'd like to impart to people, Tara?
No, really, I just want to say hi to everybody that I know that's on the chat. But also just want to say, look, guys, when you are applying for your grants, absolutely, the key for me is you must know that it is what you want to do. You must plan your project very, very, very well. And there's those two key areas you've got to address. Are you giving the grants program what they are paying for? They are paying for something. Are you giving it to them? And can you show them that you are capable? You've got the capacity, you've got the expertise, the governance, etc., in place to deliver it. Those are sort of the key points from me. And seek help if you need it. Seek help. It's out there. It's not just Whitney Consulting. There's other organisations as well. And ask the funding body. There's a grant over here, Lottery West, which anyone in WA would know. They're fabulous with helping you. They won't write it for you, but they will certainly give you guidance and help you. So ask your funding body. See what they'll give you for help.
Great. I'd just like to thank both of you so very much. We really appreciate your valuable time, your insights and wisdom. I just want to acknowledge, that such wisdom and insights we can access on either side, anywhere in between of our great country and continent. So, thank you for zooming in today. I just want to let everybody know that this webinar has been recorded. You'll be able to see it through the Foundation's Facebook site, and it's also in our YouTube channel. It's part of the LARC series of webinars, alongside all the other resources the Foundation has. So if you'd like to review it or recommend it to associates and friends, please do so. Our next webinar the details are on the website. It's around having courageous conversations. We've got a couple of guests who are going to talk about the different contexts where we have to have conversations that might make us sweat and shake a little bit. Once again, Jack and Tara, thank you so much. We appreciate your time. Thank you everybody who attended, and hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye.